The Other Westmore, Chapter 8, Surrounded, 2000. The phone had been ringing continuously for 3 minutes. Mary sat on her sofa, unflinching. She was in no mood to talk, no mood to explain, no mood for consolation. She simply leaned forward, with her elbows resting on her knees, watching the television screen flickering just 5 feet in front of her. Her hands trembled. 10 minutes ago, a news report had stopped her cold. Mary didn't watch much television. She never felt she had time, but she had just happened to have it on this evening. She saw file footage of a jewelry store she didn't recognize, its red brick exterior surrounded by police and yellow tape, accompanied by the newscaster's somber narration of events. Mary had been so busy that she was completely unaware the story had gripped the city for days, but as she sat on the sofa, she got caught up on what she had missed. 3 days earlier, in broad daylight, two masked men had run into J. Brown's jewelers waving guns at the customers, ordering them to the ground. Customers screamed in fear and quickly followed the orders as two more masked men entered. These men carried mallets in their gloved hands. The gunmen scanned the room, their weapons trained on the terrified customers and employees, their heads swiveling, looking for movement. They barked out orders over the screams of their victims. Followed the robbers' commands, the workers and customers pressed their faces to the ground. "Keep your hands on the back of your heads. I ain't playing with you," yelled one of the armed robbers. "What do you have in your hands?" Another gunman yelled to a woman who had been talking on her cell phone when the four men ran into the store. With her arms outstretched and her torso resting on the ground, she slowly closed her phone, keeping her hands in open sight. The two men with mallets were oblivious to the pandemonium around them. They headed straight to the display cases that housed the watches and necklaces. Their decisive movements showed that they knew exactly where to go and what they were looking for. One of the people being held at gunpoint was Sergeant Bruce Prothero, a 35-year-old, 13-year veteran of the Baltimore County Police Department. Earlier that day, he'd left his wife and 5 children, ranging in age from 2 to 6, to work his second job as a security guard at the jeweler's. After his wife had triplets, he needed to pick up an additional part-time job so that she could stay home with the kids. He was supposed to be off that day, but was covering for a friend who needed the day off. He was known around the department as a man ferociously devoted to protecting his family and his colleagues. Sergeant Prothero was now being held by the neck, a gun pressed to the back of his head, his hands high in the air. He was unceremoniously forced to the floor with the others. After grabbing $438,000 worth of watches and jewels from the store, one of the robbers yelled, "Let's go!" And the four ran out to the adjacent parking lot where a 1984 Oldsmobile Delta 88 and a 1987 Mercury Grand Marquis waited for them. Both cars had been bought a week earlier at an auto auction. Most of the people in the store kept their eyes closed and heads on the ground. A few, including Sergeant Prothero, raised their heads to watch the men leave. Once the thieves cleared the door, these few quickly rose to their feet. Sergeant Prothero followed his instincts and ran out after the robbers. Drawing his weapon from his holster, he sprinted through the entrance. He looked around the parking lot for signs of the four men. He ducked behind cars, carefully peering through glass windows and above hoods. As Sergeant Prothero scampered behind the Delta 88 and began to lift his head, a black-gloved hand reached out at the window holding a handgun and let off 3 shots, striking Prothero at point-blank range. Even after getting shot twice in the chest and once in the head, Sergeant Prothero stumbled off and ran about 10 feet, finally falling in the green bushes that surrounded the jewelry store. For the next minutes, he fought a losing battle for his life. The 2 getaway cars had long since screeched out of the parking lot. Crime in Baltimore and its suburbs had spiraled out of control, particularly in the city proper. Baltimore City was now averaging over 300 murders a year, making it one of the per capita deadliest cities in America. Police officers were consistently trying to solve gun crimes, drug-related crimes, domestic abuse crimes, and robberies, but this case was different, more personal to the cops assigned to it. Not only did it take place outside of Baltimore City, in the county, an area where vicious murders were less common, but this shooting involved one of their own. All hands would be on deck to make sure that the perpetrators were brought to justice. First major lead in the case came a day after the shooting. One of the suspects called a notorious drug dealer to offer him a chance to buy some stolen watches. The drug dealer had an authorized wiretap on his phone, and as a result, the police got a search warrant and went to the house where the call originated. When they found one of the stolen watches under a seat cushion, they suspected that they had their man. He later confessed to being in on the robbery, but denied that he had pulled the trigger. Through his interviews, the police identified the 3 other men, where they lived, and more details about the crime. A day later, another member of the crew was captured. He also confessed to being at the scene, but said that he was not the one who pulled the trigger. In fact, he was later quoted as saying, "I was actually unarmed. I was just told that I could make $50,000 to break some glass." This wasn't the first trip through the criminal justice system for either of them. Both men in their early 20s had long criminal records that included drug charges, handgun violations, and assault charges. One of them had been charged a year before with 2 counts of first-degree murder for separate shootings in West Baltimore. Mary was riveted as she listened to the reporter's dry voice. It was an audacious crime, a troubling sign of the violence that felt like it was closing in on her no matter how far she moved away from the center of the city. Her phone started to ring. Again, she ignored it. Then the reporter described the final 2 suspects. The reporter warned those watching that they should be assumed to be armed and very dangerous. Mary's large television screen was now filled with photos of these suspects. Her heart broke when she saw Tony's and Wes's faces staring back at her. Midnight passed, and one day turned to the next. Mary could not sleep. She felt terrible about the death of the police officer. She prayed her sons were not responsible. As she lay in bed, she realized that no matter what the outcome, all of their lives had changed forever. Mary knew it was just a matter of time before she would become the target of questioning. She had not spoken to Wes or Tony for days, but after hearing the news, she wanted to speak to them just as much as she was sure the police did. At 4 a.m., Mary heard a loud banging on her metal front door. "Police! Open this door!" She threw on a blue robe, yelling that she was on her way. She could tell from the increasingly frenetic banging that the police were seconds away from coming in with or without an invitation. She cracked open the door, her right eye peering out to see who was waiting. She looked past the stocky man in plain clothes and saw 10, maybe more cops lined up behind him. A few wore uniforms. More were wearing plain clothes. All were tense. Some had their weapons raised, some had them holstered, their hands ready to snap the guns loose at a moment's notice. Only a thin, hollow metal door stood between her and them. The plainclothesman in front of her flashed a badge, showed a search warrant, and brusquely asked Mary for permission to enter. She took a step back, and as soon as she did, the door swung open and the officers flooded into her home. With weapons drawn, teams split up and searched for Wes, Tony, or any evidence that they had been there recently. One of the officers escorted Mary out of the house and sat her on the stairs outside. She hugged herself as the cold February air blew through her cotton bathrobe. Before long, an officer appeared before her and unleashed a barrage of sternly delivered questions. But Mary could only keep repeating the truth. She had no idea where the boys were and had not seen them in weeks. "Did you know that both of your sons are on probation?" "Yes, I did." "Tony is supposed to be on home detention for a drug conviction, and Wesley is still on probation for drug charges from a few years ago." "I know what they were on probation for, officer." "If you knew where they were, would you tell us?" Mary finally snapped at them. "Look, I just found out that my sons are wanted for killing a police officer. If I find anything out, I will tell you, and I will cooperate however I can. But right now, I don't need to be questioned like I did something wrong." The questions and searching of the house continued for the next hour. The jarring percussions of drawers being opened and closed, dressers being shifted around, and beds being flipped over rattled through the quiet night and shook Mary's nerves. Black, spit-shine police shoes with hard rubber soles cracked down on every inch of hardwood floor. Mary sat on the outdoor concrete steps with the officer standing over her, the two mirroring each other's despair and frustration. The first rays of morning lit up still deserted streets of Dundalk, Maryland, where Mary's new home was located, and the cops mounted up to leave her ransacked space. Every crevice had been inspected, every room had been searched, every secret presumably uncovered. The police departed with a threat. They would be back, and they would not leave her alone until they found Tony and Wes. To nobody's surprise, they were true to their word. The search for the Moores had just begun. 2 days after the first early morning visit, Mary's niece, Nicey's daughter, was moments from walking down the aisle for her wedding. As a recording of "Here Comes the Bride" played over the loudspeaker in the Northeast Baltimore church, the rear doors opened and the veiled bride began her slow procession toward the altar. She walked alone down the aisle as the well-wishers in the pews stood and smiled. Tony was supposed to walk arm in arm with his cousin and give her away. Her father had never been involved in her life. Her unescorted stroll down the aisle was a subtle reminder that the manhunt for two of Maryland's most wanted was still on, now on day 5. The family had been bombarded with interview requests, police questioning, and neighborhood stares. Both city and county police had been crisscrossing their jurisdictions looking for any sign of Wes and Tony. The police conducted a raid of the Circle Terrace apartments in Lansdowne where Tony lived. Acting on a tip, they combed the North Point neighborhood in Baltimore. A team of officers went by Wes's current address on the 2700 block of Calvert Street in the city, on the outskirts of Johns Hopkins University, close enough that Wes could see and hear the construction slowly creeping in around him. The police plastered the neighborhood with wanted posters advertising a sizable reward. In the evenings, a police chopper with searchlights flew over the Essex community where Wes had lived a few years earlier. The wedding was a reprieve for the family. This celebration was the first time in days that they could simply enjoy one another's company without the events of February 7th dominating the conversation. Today was supposed to be about joy and love. Following the ceremony, the doors to the church opened to a clear and cool winter day. 100 or so people slowly filed into the street. The snow had fallen a few days earlier and was now a dark slush shoveled against the sides of the road. All of the attendees loaded into their vehicles and set off for the reception hall, 10 minutes away. Each driver put on hazard lights as the slow convoy snaked its way to southeast Baltimore.